So, Art, today I want to talk a little bit about God's grace. We hear God's grace mentioned, and people say we're saved by God's grace. And one passage that is cited an awful lot is in the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, in verses 8 and 9, where it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast." So it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith." And God's grace, we know, is unmerited favor, but in Titus chapter 2, at verses 11, really 11 through 14, I'm not going to read all those, but at the very beginning of verse 11, it says, "For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us," is the next two words in the next verse. God's grace teaches us. And give me an example of where God's grace taught somebody and what they did.
Well, it's always been God's plan. Even going back to the beginning, to Genesis, we see example after example. And just one of those examples is in Genesis chapter 6, where it talks about Noah, and it mentions the word grace. Even back in the Old Testament, Genesis 6:8, it says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." And then later on, though, it mentions something Noah did. God commanded him to build the ark. He instructed him to make it, as we all know the story, out of gopher wood, and he gave him precise instructions. And it says in verse 22, so after God gave instruction, it says, "Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did."
Right. And God's grace provides instructions for man, just like he did in Noah. The question we have to ask ourselves, would Noah have been saved from the flood if he hadn't followed God's instructions? No, he wouldn't have. So God's grace provided Noah instructions, and he talks about it more in chapter 11 when Hebrews chapter 11 is really talking about faith and what faith is. And in Hebrews chapter 11 goes back to the example of Noah in building the ark, and what does it say there?
Well, as we know, this is the Faith Hall of Fame, and every time it gives an example, it says, by faith someone did something.
Right.
And then in verse 7, it says, by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness, which is according to faith.
That's a very clear passage. So Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. "For by grace you have been saved through faith." The grace is God's part. He provides us instructions. The faith, as we see from Hebrews chapter 11 and in Genesis chapter 6, is man's part. So God gives us grace. He gives us instruction. And then man's faith does what God tells him to do, and that's how grace and faith work together in the Bible.
And they go hand in hand.
They go hand in hand.
Yep.